Zoe Drayson, University of Stirling, will be talking to us about explanatory virtues, extended minds, and the primeness of mental states. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. And I feel like I should add a disclaimer, particularly after the last speaker. This talk probably has more philosophy in it than I'm entirely comfortable with. So with apologies to the non-philosophers for that. Okay, what I'm going to talk about today is a principle that I'm going to call psychological internalism, which I'll cash out a bit more in the next slide, but roughly the idea that causal explanations in psychology should only invoke internal states of the subject. Now, this principle was a major topic of debate in the 1980s when it looked like cases of psychological states with broad content, following various twin earth examples and so on, were going to violate the principle of psychological internalism. And there were various attempts in the 1980s to defend psychological internalism from these counterexamples by factoring psychological explanations into their constituents. So roughly a kind of a genuinely psychological internal component and then non-psychological external and indeed internal factors. Now, what I want to try and do today is to understand the Clark and Chalmers argument for the extended mind and Tim Williamson's arguments that knowledge is a mental state. I want to understand these as newer challenges to psychological internalism. And I want to suggest that by doing that, we can highlight some interesting parallels in the form of the two arguments. So I think that both parties are arguing that there are cases of genuinely psychological but non-factorable explanations that are distinct from these earlier broad content counterexamples and interestingly different from them. And in both cases, the appeal of the non-factorable explanation is motivated by something I'm going to call explanatory generality. Now, what I probably won't be able to wholly convince you of today, but I want to at least allude to, is that if this argument from explanatory generality works in one case, it works in the other. So that if you're a proponent of the extended mind, you should accept that knowledge is a mental state, and that if you accept that knowledge is a mental state, you should also be a proponent of the extended mind. Now, it's quite a dramatic claim, and I think it has some really interesting consequences for epistemology and philosophy of mind. Okay, so let's start by thinking about psychological internalism. So this idea that causal explanations in psychology should only invoke internal states of the subject. Now, internal here, I'm going to gloss as those states that supervene on the physical state of the subject, those states that are shared by a subject and their physical duplicate, or you can think about them as non-relational states. Now, these perhaps aren't exactly the same thing, but it's a gloss that should work for my purposes today. Now, this principle, PI, you find in the literature under various different names. So Stephen Stitch refers to it as the principle of psychological autonomy back in 1978. It's often glossed as sometimes methodological individualism or sometimes methodological solipsism. But as it is, this is a slightly broader position than the one that Jerry Fodor takes in his article on methodological solipsism. But you can see some quotes here from representative people, not all of whom are proponents of this principle, by the way. Putnam actually argues against it. But it's the idea that psychological states, psychological explanations should only appeal to factors internal to the individual in some appropriate sense, and not to aspects of their environment. So, just briefly then, psychological internalism is not a metaphysical claim about the nature of mental states. It's a principle concerning the practice of psychological explanation. Now, it may well be that your reasons for holding that principle are based on kind of solid metaphysical presuppositions, but that's not going to interest us here. It's possible to hold PI and justify it simply from, so Stitch, for example, argues that simply from observing scientific practice, you can see that psychologists do, in fact, explain this way. The other important thing to notice is that PI is not a reductionist principle. So the claim is that the psychological states of a person supervene only on the internal. It's not the claim that psychological states supervene on, say, particular tokenings of internal states. So the mental states we're going to be thinking about are propositional attitudes, and for the purposes of PI, propositional attitudes are simply relations between thinkers and propositions. PI itself is neutral on whether we want to cash out this idea of a relation to a proposition in terms of behavior, dispositions, causal roles, internal representations. So, for example, the principle of psychological internalism doesn't commit you to the idea that to believe that P is to token an internal representation with a content P. Okay, that's one way of cashing it out, but PI is neutral with regard to how we do that. Okay, so as I mentioned at the start, traditional problems for psychological internalism were based on issues about broad content, but also there's just really obvious counterexamples to psychological internalism. So factive propositional attitudes, knowing, remembering, seeing. Whether somebody knows that P seems to depend, obviously, on how the world is, because it's essential to knowing that what one knows is in fact true. And as I said, propositional attitudes with broad content, so content that is determined not just by the internal states of the person, but aspects of their environment. And so the standard strategy for preserving psychological internalism is to factor the propositional attitude into internal and external constituents, and then isolate a factor that's going to be shared by a physical duplicate. So isolate a factor that supervenes on the subject, and where that factor plays the same psychological causal explanatory role as the propositional attitude. So it may have other roles as well, but its psychological role is the same. So the standard way, for example, to think about knowledge is to say, well, actually, knowledge might look like a counterexample to psychological internalism because it requires truth of certain propositions or facts about the world. But actually, we can factor knowledge into belief, where that's some internal component, and other factors, like, for example, the truth of the belief, some sorts of justificatory conditions that might be internal or external. Broad content attitudes then can be factored into ideally narrow content attitudes and other factors. So this is a standard way, as I said, in the 1980s of dealing with what look to be counterexamples to psychological internalism. Now, I want to talk then today about these newer challenges to psychological internalism. And I realize that referring to the mid to late 1990s is perhaps not particularly an example of new things. But these are ideas that came up that aren't often discussed together, okay? So Williamson's claim that knowing is a mental state, and Clark and Chalmers' claim about the extended mind. Now, I'm not going to have time to go into huge amounts of detail, so apologies to those of you who don't know the Williamson material. I'll hopefully say enough to make it clear. Williamson argues that factive propositional attitudes, so like knowledge, can play a causal role in explanation, psychological explanation, that can't be adequately captured by factoring them into internal and external constituents. Okay? So that explanations that appeal to knowledge are genuine psychological explanations, despite the fact that they violate PI, because they require external factors, like the truth of the proposition known. So Williamson says, look, knowing figures ineliminably in causal explanations. We can't just substitute believe for know. Clark and Chalmers in The Extended Mind argue that some propositional attitudes, so the cases I'm thinking of here are in particular Otto's belief that the museum is on 53rd Street. These sorts of states can play a causal role in psychological explanation but can't, again, be adequately captured by factoring them into internal and external constituents. So internal factors about what Otto really believes, and then external factors about what's in his notebook. Again, the idea is that there are external features that play an ineliminable role. And again, this is what distinguishes these new challenges from the earlier challenges, is that it seemed quite easy to deal with the standard examples of broad content and factive mental states by saying, well, you know, yeah, we often use these in explanations, but they're not playing an essential role. We can bracket out some of these parts. And the argument in both of these approaches is that no, there are components here that to do with the external environment that can't be bracketed out of a genuine psychological explanation. Now, I don't want to overstate my case here. I am not claiming that Williamson on one hand and Clark and Chalmers on the other are making the same claims. Far from it. There's a lot of differences here. So I just want to get clear initially on what those are. So they have different targets, okay? Let's take Williamson's target is the conceptual analysis of knowledge. He's like, no, knowledge can't be conceptually analysed into belief, justification, and so on. Clark and Chalmers, I take it, their target is brain-bound approaches to cognitive science. The claim that each is making is distinct. So Williamson's claiming that the ineliminable explanatory features of the environment are semantic features, so contents and their truth values. Whereas Clark and Chalmers are claiming that the explanatory features that can't be eliminated are external mechanistic features, so something that plays into the cognitive system qua mechanism. Method, this is going to come up a bit later, but it looks like, so in Clark and Chalmers' case, they put the explanatory case for thinking of extended beliefs and explanatory work that extended belief can do, and then seem to say, well, you know, given the explanatory work it's done, you know, we should think that there are such things as extended beliefs. So you could see that as the explanatory concern driving the metaphysics. Williamson's not so clear on that and probably pushes a kind of a metaphysics-first approach. So he does actually think that there's a sort of a metaphysical argument for knowledge as a mental state that I won't be able to go into here. And he thinks that partly because of that, knowledge can play a certain explanatory role. Again, the upshot then of these two positions are quite distinct. Williamson is claiming that, look, we've got a new response to epistemic skepticism. We've got a new understanding of what things like justification, evidence, assertion, and things are because they can be understood in terms of knowledge as a mental state. The upshot of the Clark and Chalmers article is that, look, the boundaries of the cognitive system aren't necessarily the boundaries of the organism traditionally thought of. And this is going to have implications for how we treat human-computer interactions, for example, and enhancement technologies. So just because something's external to the person doesn't mean that we should think of it as a mere kind of as a mere tool or some form of scaffolding. It's actually going to be incorporated into the cognitive system. So that's just to get clear on the differences between the two. But what I want to focus on is the similarity, and that's the claim that Williamson and Clark and Chalmers both use similar arguments to challenge psychological internalism. And they do this by emphasizing the way in which non-factored psychological explanations can be better explanations than those which adhere to PI. So Williamson says, look, the primeness of mental states is shown to contribute to their value in the explanation of action. Now, Williamson's notion of primeness, we can just take it as meaning non-composite, okay, where that's just non-factorable. So to say that knowledge is prime is to say that we can't factor knowledge into, say, belief and other components. Clark and Chalmers say, look, if we embrace this active externalism, we are going to allow for a more natural explanation of all sorts of actions. Okay. So it's the explanatory power or some sort of explanatory virtues that are doing the work here, and that's where I claim that the arguments are similar. So to start with Williamson's key example then. So why think that knowledge is a mental state such that it is ineliminable from psychological explanation? So Williamson says, look, think about a burglar who spends all night ransacking a house. He's risking discovery by staying so long. Why? Well, because he knew that there's a diamond in the house. Now, according to the standard picture of how we preserve psychological internalism, we should replace claims about knowledge with claims about mere belief, some internal component, internal mental state. We should say, well, look, the burglar just believed that there was a diamond in the house. That's the psychological component. Yeah, there's other factors out there, like the belief being true. It's non-psychological. Having a true belief that there's a diamond in the house, Williamson says, doesn't seem to explain why the burglar stayed so long when he initially couldn't find it. Mere belief, you might think, doesn't have the stability of knowledge. So after searching for a while, he might come to conclude that maybe his belief was wrong. And even if you factor in the fact that his belief was true, true beliefs can be based on false premises, which are open to reconsideration. So perhaps the burglar, he truly believed that there was a diamond in the house, but that's because he believed that there was a diamond under the bed, where that was a false belief because the diamond is actually in a drawer somewhere instead. So again, true beliefs based on false premises don't have the same stability as knowledge. Now, there's a small cottage industry challenging these sorts of claims. I just want to kind of take it at face value for now. So Williamson claims that the knowledge-based explanation, the fact that the burglar knew there was a diamond in the house, is a better explanation than the factored alternative. And that this is a genuinely psychological explanation that violates psychological internalism. Clark and Chalmers, I'll go through this very briefly because I'm assuming everybody knows about Otto and his notebook. So Otto wants to go to the museum, checks his notebook, heads to 53rd Street. Why? Because Otto believed the museum was on 53rd Street. That's Clark and Chalmers' answer. Now, it looks like that violates psychological internalism, because it looks like if we remove Otto's notebook from the scenario, then he no longer believes that the museum is on 53rd Street. So it looks like a physical duplicate of Otto isn't going to have the same beliefs as him. So how do we preserve psychological internalism? Again, factor the explanation into internal psychological factors and external non-psychological factors. So Clark and Chalmers say, look, the alternative to their proposal is to say that is we explain Otto's action in terms of his current desire to go to the museum, his standing belief that the museum is on the location written in his notebook, and the accessible fact that the notebook says the museum is on 53rd Street. Okay, so this is to factor Otto's, instead of saying he's got a belief the museum is on 53rd Street, he merely has a belief about his notebook. He believes that the location of important places is in his notebook, perhaps. And, oh look, there's an external fact of the matter, the location is written in his notebook. Now, Clark and Chalmers say, yeah, but look, we don't do that normally when we explain people's behavior in this way. So take Inga, who's like Otto, but with a fully functioning memory. We don't say that Ingo had a belief that the location of the museum was stored in her memory, and then there's another factor about what is in fact stored in her memory. And so as a result of this, they want to claim that the extended belief explanation is a better explanation, okay? A genuinely psychological explanation that violates PI. So I want to talk now about what makes these better explanations. And I want to focus on a notion of explanatory generality. Now, the generality of an explanation is the range of situations to which the explanation applies, or you can think about it as the breadth of the applicability of the explanation to different circumstances. Now, it's not compulsory to think about generality in probabilistic terms, but this is the way that I've got it set out here. The generality of an explanation varies inversely with the probability of the explanandum, conditional on the negation of the explanans. So the idea is the more general the explanation, the less likely it is for the explanandum to occur in the absence of the explanans. So I'll give you an example of this. If you ask, why does he have food poisoning? Because his chicken was undercooked is a better explanation than because his poulet à la bretonne simmered with navy beans, beets, and bacon and apple cider was undercooked. Presumably because the undercooked chicken is has more generality. So he could have eaten the chicken without the accompanying navy beans, beets, and bacon, and so on, and still got the food poisoning. So that's the idea of generality. Now, generality is just one explanatory virtue. It has to be traded off against accuracy. So accuracy, again, thinking about it probabilistically, one explanation has more accuracy than another if its accuracy varies with probability of the explanandum conditional on the explanans. So here, the idea is simply that the explanans raises the probability of the explanandum. So if we say, why does he have food poisoning? Because his chicken was undercooked, has more accuracy than, oh, it was something he ate, okay? Because the fact that it was something he ate doesn't raise the probability of him getting food poisoning particularly highly, whereas eating undercooked chicken does. Now the idea is that here, what we need to take out of this is the idea that if we have two equally accurate explanations, we should prefer the more general one, because accuracy and generality are both explanatory virtues. We could talk a lot about how they interact and how they conflict, but let's just take it as read that if we have two equally accurate explanations, and one of them is more general than the other, then the general one is a better explanation, all other things considered. That's what I want to say about generality. Okay, so let's go back to the case of Williamson and the burglar. Now, Williamson, remember, says that the burglar's knowing that the diamond is in the house is a better explanation than one that decomposes into beliefs and their truth. But Williamson's aware that somebody might say to him, well, look, there's always going to be, if you're assuming that knowledge supervenes on the physical world in general, then there's always going to be a conjunction of internal and external factors that entails knowledge and is equally accurate. So this maximally specific condition that summarizes all the external facts and all the internal facts. That's going to entail that the burglar knows that the diamond is in the house, and so why don't we want to say that that maximally specific condition is the explanation. Now, Williamson's response to this is to invoke the generality of knowledge-based explanations. He says, look, there's going to be lots and lots of features of this maximally specific condition that are absolutely irrelevant to the action, so the burglar ransacking the house all night. They're going to concern physical events. They're no part of the causal chain between the agent's mental state and the action. And this is the important bit. The agent would have performed the action anyway, even if those features had been different. Their inclusion is a defect in the explanation. And the idea here is that the burglar ransacked the house because he knew that the diamond was there, and his knowing the diamond was there, that could have supervened on a maximally specific condition that was ever so slightly different from the one it actually did supervene on. Just one neuron firing differently, or something being slightly different in the world. So in order to preserve generality, we want to say that the best explanation of the burglar's actions was that he knew that the diamond was in the house, because that somehow captures the explanatory relevance that we want. Okay, Clark and Chalmers on generality. Clark and Chalmers face a similar challenge, one I've mentioned already. Why prefer the extended belief explanation to the factored explanation? So why not say Otto believed the location of the museum was written in his notebook? And so then he looked in his notebook. Now Clark and Chalmers want to say that this explanation is performs one step too many, that it's too complex, that their own explanation is a simpler one, which is more explanatorily powerful, that their notion of belief, used in this extended way, is more unified and more useful in explanation. Now, they don't actually specifically talk about explanatory generality here, but it seems to me, at least, that this is the obvious way to cash this out. So here's the issue. There may well be, as in the Williamson case, a combination of internal and external conditions that would be equally accurate as an explanation. So those including things like Otto believing that the location was in his notebook and it being there, and so on. But that Otto believing the museum was on 53rd Street, the extended belief, has more generality than this. Why? Well, because Otto would still have headed to 53rd Street if the address, instead of having been written in his notebook, was circled on a map in his notebook, assuming that played the appropriate role. If the address had been tattooed on his arm instead of written in the notebook, he would still have headed to 53rd Street, given his desire to go to 53rd Street. If his memory had been functioning normally, like Inga's, then he would have gone to 53rd Street, given his desire to go to the museum. So the idea here is that by attributing him with the belief that the museum is on 53rd Street, rather than these other more specific beliefs, we're capturing the explanation of the appropriate degree of relevance. So just as Williamson said previously, look, there's features that's going to be irrelevant to the obtaining of the action, going to the museum, going to 53rd Street. The agent would have performed the action anyway, even if those features had been different. So their inclusion is a defect in the explanation. So it looks like Clark and Chalmers' argument for Otto's extended belief has a similar form to Williamson's one about the burglar. Now, it's really important here to see that I'm not claiming that there's an entailment in either direction between Williamson's conclusion that knowledge is a mental state and Clark and Chalmers' conclusion that the mechanisms of cognition extend beyond the brain and the body. Okay, I take it that these are entirely distinct claims. So I think, for example, that knowledge is a mental state. Williamson's claim is entirely consistent with the mechanisms of cognition being brain-bound. Okay, Williamson's just not concerned with the mechanisms of cognition and where they are in that sense. I also think that extended minds are the claim that the mind extends beyond the brain and the body is consistent with the semantic values of mental states playing no causal explanatory role. The work is entirely being done by the, if you like, the vehicles of these contents. And so in this sense, given that Williamson's argument does appeal, relies on semantic values of mental states, truth values, then these seem to be quite distinct claims. What I am claiming is that both positions rely on the same argument from explanatory generality. And to the extent that they do so, there's a prima facie case that accepting the argument in one case justifies accepting it in the other. Now, as I said at the start, I'm not going to be able to fully justify that claim to you. today, but I just want to unpack it a bit more and see what it involves. Now, first of all, notice that this is a conditional claim to the extent that they both rely on the argument from explanatory generality. We should think that if you accept one, you accept the other. You accept knowledge as a mental state, you accept the extended mind, vice versa. So it's important to see what extent they do rely on this explanatory generality argument. Now, Williamson's argument for the primeness of knowledge, knowledge being non-factorable, has an additional component to the explanatory generality argument that we've looked at. It has a metaphysical component that I'm not going into today, even if you ask me nicely. It's not always clear whether he thinks the explanatory component is secondary to that, but the fact is that even if it is, given that proponents of extended cognition like arguing from explanatory concerns to metaphysical claims, then I take it that given that Williamson's has this argument, this explanatory argument, they would actually take that as good enough reasons for perhaps drawing the metaphysical conclusions. So that doesn't really seem to matter. The fact that he has this other metaphysical argument seems to be somewhat irrelevant, because it looks like if we're granting the appropriate background assumptions, the generality argument is going to be sufficient to establish that knowledge is a mental state. Now, Clark and Chalmers' argument relies on explanatory concerns, and as I mentioned earlier, they don't specifically appeal to generality in the way that I have defined it. But I do think that the strongest way to make their explanatory case is to appeal to generality in this way. And one reason for this, and this is really just an aside, but I think the appeal to explanatory generality gives you a really strong argument for the extended mind that doesn't rely, not nearly so much, as on functionalism and the parity principle and so on and so forth. So I think that given the appropriate background assumptions, the generality argument is going to be sufficient to establish the extended mind. So that's the role, I think, that the generality argument plays for both Williamson and Clark and Chalmers. They both rely on it to a roughly equal extent, I want to say. Okay, my claim. This is where things get somewhat dramatic and perhaps under-argued, but here's what I want to claim. If you accept the generality-based argument for knowledge as a mental state, you should, ceteris paribus, accept the generality-based argument for the extended mind, and vice versa. Now, obviously, a lot's going to hang on what these ceteris paribus conditions are. You might well think that perhaps Williamson has extra premises that Clark and Chalmers would deny, and vice versa. But those are something that we'd have to look more at. It's not clear to me that there are any obvious ones. Okay, consequences then of this claim. If this is true, then let's say Tim Williamson thinks knowledge is a mental state on the basis of explanatory generality. Therefore, he should also think that the mechanisms of cognition can't be factored into neural and non-neural constituents. Now, I take it that Williamson wouldn't have a huge problem with this. I think he'd be absolutely fine in accepting that. He'd say, yeah, no, that's fine. Let's just say Otto has the standing belief that the museum is on 53rd Street before he even checks his notebook. Yeah, it doesn't seem to me that there is anything obvious about this case that would lead Williamson to say, no, that's not a belief, okay? Now, I think the more interesting case is the other direction. So Clark and Chalmers argue on the basis of explanatory generality that the mind extends. Therefore, on the same basis, explanatory generality, they should accept that knowledge is a mental state, which can't be factored into narrow and broad constituents. Now, notice what this means. To say that knowledge is a mental state in this sense is not to say that knowledge is some sort of internal particular, like a vehicle of representation. It's simply to say that the person, that the knower is in a mental state. To be in a state of knowledge is to be in a mental state. But given the primeness considerations of knowledge, the causal role of knowledge can't be reduced to physical or functional properties of internal particulars, okay? Because broad semantic contents and truth values are playing a causal role here. Now that means that the causal role of knowledge can't be reduced to the causal role of belief. And that's the case whether or not beliefs supervene on the internal states of the subject or not. Now the upshot of all of this is that if Otto knows that the museum is on 53rd Street, Clark and Chalmers have to commit to the idea that he's in a mental state distinct from believing that the museum is on 53rd Street. That's something they may or may not be happy with. Where I think this gets really interesting is that Williamson makes his claims about primeness and non-factorability, not just for knowledge and other factive mental states, but for mental states in general. So he thinks most propositional attitudes are non-factive. Now, again, the issue here is going to be with whether it's exactly the same primeness arguments, so exactly the same explanatory generality concerns that apply to his arguments, to his claim that other mental states, non-factive ones, are also non-factorable in this way. But if other mental states are prime, then they can't be identified with any individual component of a cognitive system, representational or otherwise. Okay, which means that if mental states are prime, then the extended mind thesis isn't consistent with the claim that mental states are token particulars, either internal or external. And this would mean that Inge's standing belief about the museum is no more internally located than Otto's. So on this understanding of mental states that Williamson's primeness argument gives us, he's very clear that subjects are in mental states, not vice versa, okay? So there is no, if you can't factor out some sort of internal component that functions as the mental state for a psychological explanation, then mental states aren't internal particulars. There is no internal particular, like a tokening of a mental representation, that could be identified as a mental state here. So if you think about it, mental states are essentially relational, okay? So propositional attitudes are relations to propositions, which means that prime mental states are non-reductive. Now, and I say this is where it gets interesting because claims about the extended mind are often put forward at the same time as claims about extended cognitive systems. Now, I've argued in the past that we have to separate these out. And you can see that as a new version of that argument. So if mental states are prime, mental states can't be identified with components of cognitive systems, okay? And this is going to apply regardless of whether the cognitive system is internal or extended or how we want to think about the cognitive architecture of that system. Prime mental states don't supervene just on cognitive mechanisms. They also supervene on broad semantic considerations, truth values, so on and so forth. Which means that proponents of the extended mind argument, thought of as the Otto thought experiment establishes, they can argue that folk psychological mental states don't supervene on the internal states of the subject. So make an argument that violates psychological internalism. But they can't then identify these mental states as particular components of a cognitive mechanism. So it's true that, say that Otto believes that the museum is on 53rd Street. That's a belief that doesn't supervene on his on the internal state of his system. But it's not to say that the notebook is a mental state. Otto is in a mental state. There are not mental states in Otto, or indeed in his cognitive system external to his organismic boundaries. And likewise, proponents of extended cognitive mechanisms can talk about the location of cognitive states. But then they can't identify these cognitive states with folk psychological mental states. Now, at this point, you might think, well, hang on, we're just back in old territory here, which we are. What we're saying is that if mental states are prime, folk psychological mental states can't be identified with the components of cognitive systems, which is, depending on where your sympathies lie, either a great argument for the autonomy of folk psychology, its non-reducibility, or a great argument for the eliminativism of folk psychology. The idea that our folk psychological categories don't pick out anything scientifically interesting. I leave it entirely up to you which way you want to go on this. The reason it matters for us is that it looks like claims about the extended mind are going to be very distinct from claims about extended cognition. And this is where we get to the interesting epistemological consequences. So a lot of people here are interested in the implication of extended mind, extended cognition, etc., for epistemology. Now, I want to say that those implications are going to vary depending on how naturalized you want your epistemology to be. So if what's essential to knowledge as you understand it is its relation to beliefs and actions thought of folk psychologically, then epistemology can draw on claims about the extended mind, as argued for in the Otto thought experiment, and get interesting claims, perhaps, about knowledge as a mental state. But if what's essential to your understanding of knowledge is its relation to the scientific study of the mechanisms of cognition, and again, I'm not pushing one or other here in terms of naturalized versus non-naturalized epistemology. I'm simply laying out territory. But if you are a fully paid up naturalized epistemologist, then you're going to think that epistemology can draw on claims about extended cognition, where I take it these are claims largely motivated by methodological considerations in cognitive science. The upshot of all of which is this. So I've argued that if we understand Williamson and Clark and Chalmers as putting forward similar challenges to psychological internalism, which is the setup that I did, I argued that we can see both of them as employing the same argument from explanatory generality to deny that mental states can be factored into internal and external components. They disagree about the internal and external components involved, but that's the argument. And assuming that we accept the relevant background assumptions of both positions, which again I know is a big assumption, then it looks like accepting the argument from generality in one case will justify accepting it in the other. So if you think that knowledge is a mental state based on explanatory generality, then you should think that there are extended minds, and vice versa. And if we do that, then there are going to be interesting epistemic consequences. It looks like the extended mind might well, the arguments for the extended mind might well transfer to arguments that knowledge is a mental state. But interestingly, it's also going to drive a wedge between claims about the extended mind, folk psychologically construed, and claims about extended cognition, scientifically construed. And that, I take it, will also transfer into driving a wedge between the epistemological consequences that we get out of this, depending on whether one is a naturalized epistemologist or not. Thank you.